morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of the Hindu Kush Mountains as Lieutenant Sarah Chen adjusted her tactical vest one final time. The intelligence briefing had been clear but troubling. A high-value target, suspected of coordinating attacks against coalition forces, had taken refuge in a fortified compound built into the mountainside. What made this mission particularly challenging was the location itself. The compound sat perched on a cliff face, accessible only by a narrow mountain path that wound treacherously around the rock face. Sarah had been with SEAL Team 7 for 3 years now, one of the first women to successfully complete the grueling training program and earn her place among the elite Special Operations Force. Her teammates had long since stopped seeing her as anything other than another highly trained operator, but she knew that every mission still carried the weight of proving herself worthy of the trident she wore with pride. The team consisted of 6 operators, each bringing specialized skills to the table. Rodriguez handled explosives and breaching, Thompson was their sniper, Kowalski managed communications, Martinez served as their medic, Williams operated as point man, and Sarah functioned as their intelligence specialist and secondary sniper. They had worked together for over 18 months, developing the kind of trust that only comes from facing life-and-death situations as a unit. As they approached the target area, under cover of darkness, Sarah reviewed the satellite images one more time. The compound was built like a fortress, with high stone walls and strategically placed guard positions. Intelligence suggested at least 12 hostiles, possibly more, with heavy weapons and a clear advantage due to their elevated position. The narrow path leading to the compound would force the team into a vulnerable single-file approach, making them easy targets for defenders above. The plan was straightforward in concept, but complex in execution. They would approach from 3 different angles, with Sarah and Thompson taking overwatch positions on an adjacent ridge while the other 4 moved up the main approach. Once the assault team was in position, Sarah and Thompson would provide covering fire and eliminate any threats that revealed themselves on the walls or guard towers. But as they began their approach in the pre-dawn darkness, everything changed. The intelligence had been compromised. Instead of 12 defenders, the compound housed nearly 30 armed militants, and they had been expecting the SEAL team. As Sarah and Thompson reached their overwatch position, muzzle flashes erupted from multiple positions along the compound walls. The first indication that something was wrong came through Kowalski's radio transmission. His voice crackled with urgency as he reported movement on their flanks. Additional hostiles were attempting to surround the assault team. Sarah immediately shifted her position to provide better coverage, scanning through her rifle scope for targets. Through her scope, she could see Martinez and Williams pinned down behind a cluster of rocks about 200 meters from the compound entrance. Rodriguez was attempting to reach them, but was being forced to take cover as automatic weapons fire peppered the ground around him. Kowalski was coordinating with base, while trying to find a position where his radio would maintain clear communication. Thompson's rifle barked beside her as he engaged a target on the compound's eastern wall. Sarah followed suit, taking careful aim at a militant who was attempting to flank their teammates from the north. The bullet found its mark, and the threat was eliminated. But for every hostile they neutralized, 2 more seemed to take their place. The firefight continued for nearly an hour as the SEAL team fought to maintain their positions against overwhelming odds. Sarah had expended most of her ammunition and was down to her last magazine when she noticed movement on the ridge above their position. A group of militants had somehow managed to circle around behind them, climbing up the backside of the ridge to gain a superior firing position. She immediately alerted Thompson, but as they prepared to engage these new threats, disaster struck. A rocket-propelled grenade exploded against the rocks just below their position, sending chunks of stone and debris flying in all directions. The blast was close enough that Sarah felt the heat wash over her, and the concussion left her ears ringing. When the smoke cleared, Thompson was unconscious, blood trickling from a head wound where a piece of shrapnel had struck him. Sarah quickly checked his pulse and breathing. He was alive but in no condition to continue fighting. She was now alone on the ridge with enemy forces approaching from multiple directions. The tactical situation had deteriorated rapidly. Her teammates below were still pinned down and running low on ammunition. Thompson needed immediate medical attention, and she was about to be overrun by hostiles who had gained the high ground. Making matters worse, her radio had been damaged in the explosion, cutting off her communication with both her team and base. Sarah made a split-second decision that would change everything. Rather than attempt to hold their current position against impossible odds, she would create a diversion that might give her teammates the opportunity they needed to break contact and reach a more defensible position. But the only way to draw the militants' attention away from her pinned teammates was to make herself an even more attractive target. She gathered Thompson's rifle and remaining ammunition, along with her own gear, and began moving toward the highest point on the ridge. The militants who had been approaching their position immediately shifted their fire toward her, exactly as she had hoped. But in doing so, she had also positioned herself at the edge of a cliff that dropped nearly 300 feet to the valley below. The rocks beneath her feet were loose and treacherous, worn smooth by years of wind and weather. As she attempted to find stable firing positions while engaging the approaching hostiles, she could feel the ground shifting beneath her boots. Each shot she fired seemed to draw more enemy attention, and bullets were now striking the rocks all around her position. From below, she could hear Rodriguez shouting instructions to the rest of the team. They were beginning to move, using the distraction she had created to advance toward a more defensible position. But Sarah's situation was becoming increasingly desperate. She was outnumbered at least 6-1, running low on ammunition and trapped on unstable ground at the edge of a cliff. As she engaged another target, a militant who had been attempting to flank her position from the east, Sarah felt the rock beneath her left foot give way completely. She threw herself backward, trying to regain her balance, but more stones began sliding away beneath her. The militants, seeing her predicament, pressed their attack even harder. In that moment, Sarah realized that her only chance of survival lay not in continuing to fight from her current position, but in doing something that would seem impossible to any rational observer. The cliff face below her was nearly vertical, with very few handholds visible in the early morning light. Any normal person would consider a fall from this height to be certain death. But Sarah Chen was not a normal person. She was a Navy SEAL, trained to survive in the most hostile environments on Earth. As bullets continued to strike the rocks around her and the ground beneath her feet continued to crumble away, she made a decision that would test every skill she had learned during her years of training. The militants watched in satisfaction as the female soldier who had been causing them so much trouble finally lost her footing completely. They saw her rifle go flying as she fell backward off the cliff, her equipment scattered across the rocks. Several of them moved to the edge to confirm their victory, expecting to see her broken body in the valley far below. What they found instead would haunt their memories for the rest of their lives, however long those might be. The cliff face that had seemed so insurmountable, so perfectly vertical, was about to become the stage for a demonstration of just what a Navy SEAL could accomplish when failure meant death. As Sarah disappeared from view, falling into the shadows cast by the towering rock face, the militants believed they had eliminated their most dangerous opponent. They began to redirect their attention toward the other SEAL team members below, confident that they had reduced the threat by 1/6. They had no idea that they had just made the worst tactical error of their lives. In their arrogance and haste to claim victory, they had forgotten one of the most basic principles of warfare. Never assume your enemy is defeated until you can confirm the kill. And Sarah Chen was very much alive. The fall lasted only seconds, but to Sarah, it felt like an eternity. As she tumbled through the air, her training kicked in automatically. She twisted her body to avoid the rocky outcroppings that jutted from the cliff face, using her arms to protect her head while scanning desperately for anything that might break her fall or provide a handhold. 30 feet down from the edge, her left hand caught a narrow ledge of rock that barely provided enough grip for her fingers. The sudden stop sent shooting pain through her shoulder and elbow, but she held on. Her body swung against the cliff face with tremendous force, and she had to bite back a cry of pain as her ribs impacted against the hard stone. For a moment, she hung there in the shadows, catching her breath and assessing her situation. The ledge was no more than 3 inches wide, barely enough to support her weight with her fingertips. Below her, the cliff face continued down for another 250 feet before reaching the valley floor. Above, she could hear the militants talking excitedly in their local dialect, apparently discussing whether they needed to confirm her death. Sarah knew she had perhaps minutes before they would either move on to engage her teammates or send someone down to verify that she had been eliminated. Neither option was acceptable. She needed to find a way back up the cliff face, and she needed to do it without being seen or heard. As her eyes adjusted to the dimmer light in the shadow of the cliff, she began to make out details of the rock face that had been invisible from above. The stone was sedimentary limestone, carved over millennia by wind and water into a surface that offered numerous small holds and cracks. What had appeared to be a smooth, unclimbable wall from a distance was actually covered with tiny ledges, crevices, and rough spots that could support her weight if she was careful and precise. Sarah had been rock climbing since she was 12 years old, first as a hobby with her father, then as serious training during her military career. She had scaled cliff faces in a dozen different countries, in conditions ranging from desert heat to Arctic cold. But she had never attempted a free climb while under enemy fire, with her teammates' lives hanging in the balance, and with no safety equipment whatsoever. She began to move laterally along the narrow ledge, searching for a route that would take her up and around to a position where she could outflank the militants who thought they had killed her. Her movements had to be absolutely silent. Any sound that carried up to the cliff edge could alert the enemy to her survival. The limestone offered better holds than she had hoped. Thousands of years of erosion had created a network of small cracks and protrusions that her fingers could grip. The key was to distribute her weight carefully, never trusting her entire body weight to a single hold, and to test each grip thoroughly before committing to the next move. 20 feet to her right, she found a vertical crack that extended upward for at least 30 feet. It was wide enough for her to insert her fingers and toes, using a climbing technique called jamming, to work her way up. The crack was rough and sharp, tearing at her gloves and cutting into her hands, but it provided the secure hold she needed to begin her ascent. As she climbed, Sarah could hear the firefight continuing above. Her teammates were still engaged with the enemy forces, but the sound of gunfire was becoming more sporadic. She hoped this meant they had found better positions and were conserving ammunition, but she feared it might indicate they were running low on supplies. The crack took her up 40 feet before branching into a series of smaller fissures. She chose the rightmost branch, which angled back toward the area where the militants had last been positioned. The holds were smaller here, requiring more precise finger strength and balance, but they were sufficient to support her weight as she continued her silent ascent. Halfway up the cliff face, she encountered her first major obstacle. A section of the rock had sheared away at some point in the past, creating a smooth overhang that extended out from the cliff face by nearly 4 feet. There was no way around it. She would have to climb upside down along the underside of the overhang to continue her route. Overhang climbing was one of the most demanding forms of rock climbing, requiring tremendous upper body and core strength. Sarah positioned herself carefully beneath the overhang, finding holds for her hands while her feet searched for purchase on the underside of the rock. Her abdominal muscles burned as she pulled herself along the inverted surface, fighting gravity with every movement. The overhang stretched for 12 grueling feet. By the time she pulled herself over the lip and back onto the vertical face, her arms were shaking with fatigue and her hands were bleeding through her torn gloves. But she had gained valuable altitude and was now positioned well to the side of where the militants expected any threat to appear. As she continued climbing, Sarah began to plan her next moves. She had lost her rifle in the fall, but she still had her sidearm and several magazines of ammunition. More importantly, she had something the militants would never expect: the element of surprise. They believed she was dead, which meant they were no longer watching for threats from her direction. The final 50 feet of the climb were the most technically challenging. The rock face became increasingly vertical, with fewer large holds available. Sarah had to rely on small crimps and edges that barely accommodated her fingertips. Each move had to be planned carefully, as a single mistake could send her falling back to the valley floor below. 20 feet from the top, she paused to rest and listen. The gunfire above had stopped almost entirely, replaced by occasional shouts in the local dialect. She could hear movement directly above her position, suggesting that at least some of the militants were still in the immediate area. This was actually good news. It meant they were not all focused on pursuing her teammates. Sarah chose her final route carefully. angling toward a spot where a cluster of boulders near the cliff edge would provide immediate cover once she reached the top. The last 20 feet required every technique she had mastered over years of climbing. She used heel hooks to take weight off her arms, mantled over small ledges, and even employed a dynamic move where she had to leap from one hold to another. As her fingers closed over the final handhold at the cliff edge, Sarah could hear voices just yards away from her position. She pulled herself up slowly, keeping her movements minimal until she could assess the tactical situation. What she saw made her blood run cold. Thompson was still unconscious where she had left him, but now 3 militants were standing over him, apparently debating whether to take him prisoner or execute him immediately. Their weapons were lowered as they talked, and their attention was completely focused on their captive. 2 more militants were positioned near the edge where she had fallen, occasionally glancing down into the valley while maintaining watch over the approaches their comrades were using to pursue her teammates. These 2 were armed with automatic rifles and appeared to be the most alert of the group. Sarah realized she was in a perfect position to turn the tables on her enemies. They had made several critical tactical errors while believing they had eliminated her as a threat. They had bunched up instead of maintaining proper spacing. They had allowed their guard to drop while discussing their prisoner. And most importantly, they had positioned themselves with their backs to the only route by which she could return. She drew her sidearm slowly, making sure not to create any sound or movement that might alert the militants to her presence. The weapon was a Sig Sauer P226, a pistol she had trained with extensively and could employ with deadly accuracy at the ranges involved. But she would need to be fast and precise. She was outnumbered 5 to 1, and once the shooting started, she would have only seconds before they could return fire. Sarah took a deep breath and began to move. The first 2 militants never knew what hit them. Her bullets found their marks before they could even turn around. The 3 standing over Thompson reacted more quickly, but they were caught off guard and had to bring their weapons up from lowered positions. The closest militant managed to get his rifle halfway to his shoulder before Sarah's bullet took him down. The second one actually got a shot off, but his hasty aim sent the bullet wide, chipping rock near Sarah's position. Her return shot was not wide. The last militant made the smart tactical decision to dive for cover behind a large boulder, but in doing so, he moved away from Thompson instead of using the unconscious SEAL as a human shield. This gave Sarah the opportunity she needed to advance to a position where she could engage him safely. The brief firefight was over in less than 30 seconds. 5 militants who had believed they controlled the high ground were now eliminated, and Sarah had secured Thompson's position. But she knew this was only the beginning. There were still more than 20 hostiles in the area, and her teammates below were still in danger. As she checked Thompson's condition and retrieved his rifle, Sarah could hear shouts coming from the direction of the compound. The gunfire had alerted the remaining militants that something had gone wrong with their flanking party. Soon they would send reinforcements to investigate, and she needed to be ready for them. But now the tactical situation had changed dramatically. Instead of being trapped and outnumbered, Sarah had eliminated a significant threat and gained access to additional weapons and ammunition. More importantly, she was now positioned where she could provide the covering fire her teammates needed to break contact and reach safety. The militants in the compound had no idea that the woman they thought they had killed was now behind them, armed and very much alive. They were about to learn a hard lesson about underestimating a Navy SEAL. Sarah quickly established a defensive position among the boulders near the cliff edge, using the rocky terrain to provide both cover and concealment. Thompson was beginning to regain consciousness, groaning softly as he tried to focus his eyes. She administered a quick field assessment, probable concussion, but no signs of serious internal injury or skull fracture. "Thompson," she whispered urgently, "can you hear me? We're still in contact." His eyes found her face and gradually showed recognition. "Chen, how did you—" "I thought you went over the cliff." "I did." "Long story. Can you fight?" Thompson tested his grip on his rifle and nodded slowly. "Vision's a bit blurry, but I can shoot. What's our situation?" Before Sarah could answer, the sound of approaching voices echoed from the direction of the compound. At least 8 militants were moving toward their position, drawn by the gunfire. Sarah could hear them calling to their dead comrades, growing more agitated when they received no response. "We've got company coming," Sarah informed Thompson. "I count at least 8, probably more. The rest of the team is pinned down about 300 meters southeast of here. We need to break this up and give them room to maneuver." Thompson positioned himself behind a large boulder, testing his sight picture through his rifle scope. "I can take overwatch. You're more mobile. If you can get to a flanking position, we can catch them in a crossfire." Sarah studied the terrain between their current position and the approaching militants. A series of smaller ridges and rock formations provided potential cover for a flanking maneuver. It would be dangerous, requiring her to move through areas with limited concealment, but it was their best option for breaking the enemy's numerical advantage. "Give me 3 minutes to get into position," she told Thompson. "When you hear my first shot, start engaging targets from the east side of their formation. I'll take them from the west." Moving low and fast, Sarah began working her way around the militants' expected approach route. The terrain was treacherous, filled with loose stones that could give away her position if she wasn't careful. She had to balance speed with stealth, knowing that Thompson couldn't hold off 8 attackers indefinitely if they reached his position. As she moved, Sarah could hear the militants spreading out as they approached the area where their comrades had been killed. They were being more cautious now, realizing that someone had survived their attack and eliminated 5 of their number. Their voices carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Sarah reached a position approximately 100 meters west of where Thompson waited. From here, she could see 4 of the militants as they advanced up the slope toward the boulder field. They were moving in a loose skirmish line, weapons ready, scanning constantly for threats. The first shot was crucial. It would announce her presence and position to every hostile in the area, but it would also give Thompson the signal he needed to begin his own engagement. Sarah chose her target carefully, the militant who appeared to be leading the group, positioned slightly ahead of the others. Her bullet took him in the center of his chest, and he dropped immediately. The other militants reacted with trained reflexes, diving for cover while trying to locate the source of the shot. But Thompson was already engaging from his position, his rifle cracking steadily as he targeted the militants on the eastern side of their formation. The crossfire created exactly the effect Sarah had hoped for. Caught between 2 positions and unable to effectively return fire against either without exposing themselves to the other, the militants found themselves in an untenable tactical situation. 2 more went down in the first 30 seconds of the engagement. But the remaining 5 militants were experienced fighters. Instead of panicking, they began attempting to bound backward toward cover, with some members providing suppressing fire, while others moved. Sarah had to admire their discipline even as she worked to eliminate them. She shifted position after each shot, using the rocky terrain to mask her movement. The militants were trying to fix her location by watching for muzzle flashes, but the echo effect created by the surrounding cliffs made it difficult for them to pinpoint exactly where she was firing from. Thompson's shooting was methodical and precise despite his head injury. Each time a militant exposed himself to fire in Sarah's direction, Thompson's rifle would bark, and another threat would be eliminated. Within 5 minutes, the 8-man patrol had been reduced to 2 survivors who were now trying desperately to retreat back toward the compound. Sarah made a tactical decision that would prove crucial to the mission's success. Instead of simply eliminating the fleeing militants, she allowed one of them to escape while capturing the other. A prisoner could provide valuable intelligence about the compound's defenses and the number of remaining hostiles. The captured militant was young, probably no more than 20 years old and clearly terrified. Sarah's Pashto was limited, but she knew enough to ask basic questions about the compound's layout and defensive positions. What she learned changed her understanding of the entire situation. According to the prisoner, the compound housed not just the high-value target they had come to capture, but also 3 Western hostages, aid workers who had been kidnapped 6 weeks earlier and were being held for ransom. This information had not been included in their mission briefing, which meant either intelligence had failed to discover the hostages' presence or the decision had been made not to inform the SEAL team about this complication. The presence of hostages completely altered the tactical requirements for the mission. What had been planned as a direct assault with the option for close air support or artillery strikes was now a delicate hostage rescue operation requiring surgical precision and minimal collateral damage. Sarah immediately attempted to contact her team leader, Rodriguez, using the radio she had recovered from one of the eliminated militants. After several attempts, she managed to establish communication with the rest of the team, who had successfully broken contact and moved to a more defensible position about half a kilometer from the compound. Rodriguez, this is Chen. I'm alive and have secured Thompson's position. We've eliminated 13 hostiles, but we have a major problem. There are Western hostages in the compound. 3 aid workers held in the lower level. The pause before Rodriguez responded told Sarah everything she needed to know. This information was news to him as well. Chen, confirm. Hostages in the target building? Confirmed. Young male prisoner appears reliable. 3 Western hostages, lower level of main structure. This changes everything about our approach. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio as he processed this new information. Agreed, we need to abort the original plan. Can you and Thompson reach our position? Sarah studied the terrain between their current location and where she estimated the rest of the team to be positioned. Negative. We'd have to cross too much open ground, and there are still hostiles between us, but I have a better idea. What Sarah proposed was audacious even by Navy SEAL standards. Instead of attempting to reach her teammates or calling for extraction, she suggested that she and Thompson execute a 2-person hostage rescue operation while the other 4 team members created a diversion to draw the remaining militants away from the compound. The plan required precise timing and flawless execution. Rodriguez and his team would approach the compound from the east, making enough noise to convince the defenders that this was the main assault. Meanwhile, Sarah and Thompson would infiltrate the compound from the west, using the cliff face that Sarah had already proven could be climbed to access the lower levels where the hostages were being held. It was dangerous and relied on numerous factors beyond their control, but it offered the best chance of extracting the hostages alive while still accomplishing their primary mission. Rodriguez gave his approval, and they began coordinating the timing for their synchronized operations. As Sarah and Thompson prepared for their infiltration, the captured militant provided additional crucial information. The hostages were being held in what had originally been a storage cellar, accessible through a door in the compound's western wall. This entrance was lightly guarded because the militants considered the cliff face to be an impassable natural barrier. They had clearly never encountered a Navy SEAL who specialized in impossible climbs. The descent was actually more challenging than Sarah's earlier ascent had been. She had to lower Thompson first, using a rope improvised from the dead militant's equipment. His head injury made it difficult for him to maintain proper balance, and she had to guide his movements carefully to prevent a fall that could alert the guards above. Once Thompson was safely positioned on a ledge halfway down the cliff face, Sarah followed, carrying both their weapons and the additional ammunition they had recovered. The western wall of the compound was built directly into the rock face, with the cellar entrance accessible via a narrow ledge that ran along the base of the wall. As they approached the entrance, Sarah could hear voices from inside the compound. The diversion created by Rodriguez's team was working. Most of the remaining militants had moved to defensive positions facing east, leaving only a skeleton force to guard the interior areas. The cellar door was secured with a simple wooden bar, probably intended more to keep the hostages inside than to keep rescuers out. Sarah and Thompson removed the bar silently and prepared to breach the entrance. They had no idea what they would find inside or whether the hostages were guarded. What they discovered when they opened the door would test every skill they had developed during their years of training. The 3 hostages were indeed in the cellar, but they were not alone. 2 militants were guarding them, and one had a gun pressed against a young woman's head while shouting questions at her in broken English. Sarah and Thompson had perhaps 2 seconds to assess the situation and act before the guards could harm or kill the hostages. In that moment, all their training, all their experience, and all their commitment to leaving no one behind would be put to the ultimate test. The rescue operation that followed would become legendary within the special operations community, studied and analyzed by future generations of SEALs as an example of how proper training, tactical flexibility, and sheer determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. But for Sarah Chen, hanging by her fingertips from a cliff face while bullets flew overhead, it was simply another day's work for a Navy SEAL who understood that failure was never an option when lives hung in the balance. The mission that had begun with Sarah being thrown from a cliff would end with her proving that for a properly trained Navy SEAL, there is no such thing as an insurmountable obstacle. There are only challenges waiting to be overcome.